Tanweer. Ms. Tanweer is a student in the dual master's degree program in journalism and Middle Eastern and North African studies and plans to graduate next month, much as we'd really much rather that she not. We'll see what we can do. She received her BA in anthropology from the University of Pittsburgh, from which she graduated summa cum laude. Ms. Tanweer has received numerous scholarships. As an undergraduate, she was awarded a National Science Foundation Research Experience Grant. As a graduate student, she's received Foreign Language and Area Studies, or FLAS, fellowships for the study of Persian, a Roshan Cultural Foundation Graduate Fellowship, and several School of Journalism scholarships. As a graduate student at the UA, Anissa Tanweer has gained extensive journalistic experience. She's been a radio news intern at Arizona Public Media, KUAC, and served as a stringer for the New York Times in Tucson when she assisted with coverage following the January 8, 2011 mass shooting. Currently, she's an apprentice at the Arizona Daily Star. She's also assisting journalism professor Maggie Sanger in implementing the U.S. Department of State project to develop the curriculum for a new journalism department at Nangarhar University in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. Her presentation today relates to work and research she did while an English service intern at Peshawar Afghan News Agency in Kabul, Afghanistan during the summer of 2011. Please join me in welcoming Anissa Tanweer, who's going to speak to us about media development and the peace-building agenda. Thank you.
So before we start, just to clarify what I mean by media development, I'm referring to interventions by international actors to develop a media sector in a particular place. And the origins of media development, interventions, and assistance go back to the end of the Cold War. So at that time, the Western democratic capitalist countries wanted to make sure that democratic processes and free market capitalism would take root in the Eastern Bloc. And so acting on the premise that a free press is essential to both of those things, they put money into the support of independent media sectors in those places. And then around the same time, in that same decade, the 1990s, when media development was really forming and evolving, a couple events sort of introduced a secondary priority to that process. So the promotion of democracy and a free market economy were still the primary goals, but there were, because of the genocide in Rwanda and ethnic cleansing campaign in Bosnia, where in both of those instances, mass media were used to incite violence, to incite one population to violence against another population. The international community sort of took note of that and thought to itself, if biased, intolerant, and inaccurate reporting of events can inflame public passion and fear, then in contrast, balanced reporting can reduce political tensions and contribute to the resolution of conflict. And that's a quote from Krishna Kumar, who's a senior social scientist at USAID. So like I said, the promotion of democracy and free market capitalism were still the primary goals of media development interventions, but this sort of secondary level priority was also introduced, that the development of independent media could help to stabilize volatile societies. And with that in mind, there are sort of there are several tactics that can be adopted. One is to pluralize media outlets so that one narrative can't dominate the public space. Another is to introduce regulatory structures to curb hate speech. And a third is to professionalize the practice of journalism. And that's primarily what we're going to be talking about in the context of Afghanistan. And just to give you a sense of sort of the scope and scale of the sort of media development interventions I'm talking about, this chart is the total spending of the top 8 donors for media development assistance from 1 year, from 2008. So if you add those up, which I did somewhere, it comes up to about $464 million, and about a quarter of it comes from the United States, which is the largest contributor to media assistance. And this money accounts for all types of media assistance, so some of that is going towards developing regulatory structure, some of it is helping with communication infrastructure, and then a portion of it would be for the kind of professional training that we're talking about. And when it comes to professional training, of course, these donor nations and agencies aren't equipped to do that themselves because they're not professional journalists. So they tend to give grants to professional practitioner organizations, one of which is the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, and these are just some of their brochures. So I'll refer to it usually as IWPR when I'm talking, because the Institute for War and Peace Reporting is a mouthful. So it started in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, so it kind of came of age at the same time that the whole media development sector was coming of age itself. And around this time, some media development practitioners that were working in post-conflict societies like IWPR became influenced by the ideas of Johan Galtung, which is this man right here. He's a Norwegian sociologist, and he is the founder or one of the architects of peace and conflict studies. And he's probably best known for coming up with the concepts of negative peace versus positive peace. But he also, in the 1970s, developed this concept of peace journalism. And so peace journalism is a highly normative concept. Basically, Galtung criticizes mainstream journalism's coverage of conflict for using what he calls a war journalism model. And war journalism focuses on violence and episodic events and ignores context and conflict resolution. So as an antidote to this, he prescribes peace journalism, and that entails a number of practices, including covering conflict before it escalates to violence, continuing to cover the conflict after violence subsides, reporting on the invisible effects of war, highlighting points of commonality between the conflicting parties, avoiding an exclusive reliance on elite sources, refraining from dichotomously categorizing different parties as like good guys and bad guys, portraying an end to the conflict as a win-win situation rather than a situation where there's one victor and one loser, and avoiding victimizing, demonizing, and emotive language. And so his ideas have gained a number of adherents and proponents, and as I said before, they've been incorporated into some of the trainings that are being conducted by these professional media development organizations around the world, including IWPR. But in spite of the fact that they're sort of, being circulated at this practical level, there isn't much scholarly literature about it. What has been written, there have been a few content analyses that have mostly found that the war journalism frame dominates coverage of conflict, as Galtung would predict that it would. There is kind of one exception to that idea that war journalism is prevalent, and that was a survey that was conducted by Shahira Fahmy from the School of Journalism here at the U of A. So when she and her co-author asked foreign correspondents if they felt in their own reporting they were adhering to certain principles of peace journalism, they felt that they did. And then aside from those studies, there are sort of normative critiques and a normative debate out there where some people feel that the whole notion of peace journalism violates norms of objectivity, and others feel that it's not really representing a new kind of journalism orthodoxy at all, and that it kind of is just a different name for a certain mode of social responsibility journalism. So what's missing from any of this literature is a concrete example to try to figure out what happens when you intentionally try to put the principles of peace journalism into practice, and especially in the context of development. And so that's what I'm doing with my thesis and my case study. So first, just a little bit about case studies. The definition of case study varies across different disciplines and authors, but a commonly cited definition is simply the use of multiple sources of evidence to investigate a contemporary phenomenon in its natural setting. And case studies are inherently limited in some ways because looking at a single case can't really ever prove a causal relationship or a theory. But they are useful in many ways. So they're particularly good for finding exceptions to generally supported theories, explaining the agents and mechanisms in an already established causal relationship, and generating directions for further research in understudied research areas. And that's sort of the goal of my research, because this is certainly an understudied area. And probably the first step in doing a case study is to figure out for yourself, what is my case a case of? So in this particular instance, I'm looking at a case of conflict framing at a news organization that was started as part of a peace-building agenda. Since we're talking about framing, just to let you know what I'm referring to, news media inevitably limit the treatment of any given topic by emphasizing one version of reality and either playing down or omitting alternative versions of reality. And so characteristics of news content, like the frequency, the tone, prominence, keywords, images, and sources, they all combine to create parameters or limits or frames within which any given topic can be conveyed, accessed, and comprehended. So in framing analysis, researchers look at all of those characteristics and try to explore the question, precisely how are issues constructed, discourse structured, and meanings developed. And I just want to draw a distinction between research that looks at frames and research that looks at framing. So in frame research, we would identify what features are present in the content and what meanings those features convey. In framing analysis, we also want to look at the processes and influences that then shape those frames. So in this study, I attempt to do both, and I do that through a quantitative content analysis that tries to identify whether war journalism frames or peace journalism frames dominate the coverage in this particular news agency I'm looking at. And then with my qualitative methods, I try to figure out what framing processes produce those frames. So, and the particular organization that I'm studying is called Pajwak Afghan News. It was started by IWPR, the media development organization that we discussed earlier. And it became Afghanistan's first independent news agency. And just to give you a very brief background of media in Afghanistan, the history of independent media there is rather slim. The first news publications were owned and operated by Afghan monarchs. And there was sort of a narrow window of editorial independence in the 60s and 70s when a sort of dissident press was allowed to emerge. But that came to a screeching halt in 1978 with the communist coup. And throughout the 80s, censorship and state media were sort of the rule of the day. So the communist regime closed a lot of papers. And then in the latter part of the 90s, when the Taliban was in power in Afghanistan, only state-operated media existed. There were some foreign news outlets that had reporters based in Afghanistan, but in terms of Afghan media, it was all owned and operated by the Taliban. So in late 2001, of course, an international coalition led by the United States toppled the Taliban, and after that, international donors started funding Afghanistan's media organization. Sorry.
Are there independent stations in Pakistan that broadcast into Afghanistan?
Yeah. So like I said, there were foreign media present there, and actually the leader of Pajwak got his start working for Pakistani-based newspapers and worked in Afghanistan throughout the 1990s. Yeah, and BBC had a correspondent based there as well. Yeah, exactly. But in terms of Afghan-owned and operated media, it was all state-run. Part of the rationale for the international community to start to fund the media sector post-2001 was to create a sort of viable alternative message to, or a viable alternative to messages from the Taliban and their supporters. And then the secondary reason was to stabilize and liberalize Afghanistan in the hopes that it wouldn't become an Al-Qaeda territory again, or a place that would be fertile for Al-Qaeda and organizations like them. So PAJWAC was started as a project in this time period, and IWPR, the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, got a grant from USAID. Initially, their objective was to transform Bakhtar news agency, which was the state-run news agency. So they wanted to turn it would still be a government-owned organization, but they wanted to turn it into something more akin to the BBC. That was a huge failure. From what I understand, the staff, the reporters, the lower-level editors were really receptive to the kinds of changes that they wanted to introduce, but that the upper-level administrators were really resistant to that. And so instead, they proposed starting a brand new independent news agency that wouldn't be associated with the government at all. And that's how PAJWAC came into existence. So they started training staff in April of 2004. And within a year, the relationship between the news agency and IWPR, the sort of parent organization, had gone really sour. So there were problems not just between the Afghan staff at the organization and IWPR, but between the IWPR staff that were located in Afghanistan and the parent organization, which is based in London. And so there were problems over resources and control and everything. And so IWPR fired the country director, who was the woman who had started the agency from its inception. And they tried to fire the lead, the head of the news agency itself, who's an Afghan man. But they couldn't, because by Afghan law, you have to have a single individual holds a license to any Afghan news outlet. And so he was the license holder. He owned the organization, so they couldn't exactly fire him. So he tells USAID that they need to cut IWPR out of the equation, or else he'll fold the whole project. And so USAID agrees, and they give their money to PAJWAC through the International Organization for Migration instead of IWPR. And IWPR still functions in Afghanistan and has projects there, and they do a lot of really great work. And I'm not trying to say anything bad about IWPR, but this is how they relate to PAJWAC. And also, I should say that they have a great relationship now, a very functional relationship between the two organizations now that they're independent of one another. So anyway, for the first year of its operation, PAJWAC was 100% funded by USAID, and gradually was sort of weaned off of those funds. And at this point, they have 3 sources of funding. So they get some specific project support from the US Embassy and also from the Open Society Institute, which is George Soros's private foundation. They do get some direct support both from OSI and from the US Embassy. And then they also have income from subscribers and advertisers. And their goal, of course, is to become financially sustainable at some point in the future. I think within the next 5 years, they would like to be self-sustaining. And so they're in the process right now of trying to diversify their income. So they're building a new media plaza, a new building that will house their offices, but they're building it with extra space so that they can rent offices out to other media organizations in order to generate some revenue for themselves. And they've also recently started a new photo service and a video service as additional income generators. So they're hopeful that in a few years they'll be self-sufficient. So what am I trying to find out by looking at PAJWAC? I'd like to know, first of all, are war journalism frames or peace journalism frames more prevalent in their coverage? Secondly, which war journalism indicators and peace journalism indicators are most prevalent and least prevalent in their coverage? Do the war and peace frames in PAJWAC's coverage vary depending on particular characteristics of the content, such as the author, the editor, the sources used, the specific content discussed, and the theater of the conflict? And finally, what influences PAJWAC's conflict framing practices at the individual level, the routines level, the organizational level, the extra media level, and the ideological level? And so I used mixed methods. For questions 1, 2, and 3, I answered those by using a quantitative content analysis. So I looked at all of PAJWAC's articles and systematically coded them and sorted them and analyzed the data. And then for question number 4, I'm relying on mixed qualitative methods. So I reviewed their internal documents. I conducted participant observation at the agency last summer and did interviews with PASWAC staff and consultants and as former IWPR staff as well. So about my content analysis, I looked at their coverage from the period of June 1st, 2011 to July 31st, 2011, and I picked that time period because it corresponds roughly with the time that I was doing my field research at the news agency. So I wanted my observations to support my findings from my quantitative research. I looked at all the stories that were published in PASWAC's English language news archive, and I did that for a couple reasons. So PASWAC publishes in 3 different languages, in English, in Pashto, and in Afghan Persian, which is called Dari. And so the way their language services work together, some stories originate in Pashto, some originate in Dari, and some originate in English. So a portion of the Pashto articles are translated into English, and a portion of the Dari articles are translated into English. But the Pashto doesn't get translated into Dari, and the Dari doesn't get translated into Pashto, and the English doesn't get translated into either of the languages. So really, if you can only look at one database, the English is the closest to being complete than any of the others. And I didn't have the ability to look at all of them, which obviously would be the ideal thing to do. But I don't have any skills in Pashto at all, and I don't think that my Persian is good enough to pick up on some of the nuances that I would have been looking for in the research. And I was largely, I'm a graduate student, and this was largely independently funded, and so I couldn't hire a translator. So there were 996 articles published in the English language archive, and I eliminated 175 of them right off the bat from analysis. 138 of them I eliminated because I had copy edited them, and that would have seriously biased my results. And 34 of them were daily security briefs, so they were compilations of other security-related stories of the day, so they would have been repetitious. And then 3 were just duplicates, and in those cases, I eliminated the first one and retained the more recent article for analysis. So that left 821 stories, and 469 of them were about violent conflict. So those were the ones that ended up being coded. So they were coded based on the author, the English editor, the particular conflict. So for example, if it was about the Afghan insurgency or about a more local tribal or ethnic conflict, the theater of the conflict, so did it take place, was it contained within Afghanistan, or was it about violence that was occurring across the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan? The types of sources that were used, so were they official sources, militant sources, or what I'll refer to as people sources, which means somebody who's a non-combatant and a non-official. And then for the war and peace journalism indicators that were present in the story. And so for the war and peace journalism indicators, I borrowed from a previous content analysis that looked at war journalism and peace journalism in Asian newspaper coverage of regional conflicts by Xiaoting Li and Crispin Maslog. And so they developed this index based on the writings of Johan Galtung, who we've already discussed. And I relied really heavily on what they did, but I did make a few changes. So I eliminated a couple of the categories that had to do with reporting before and after the conflict, because they weren't relevant, because I was talking about a 2-month time period in the middle of a conflict, so I couldn't really judge their coverage on whether it reported leading up to the conflict and following it. And then I just changed the verbiage in some of the categories to make them more internally coherent and to make sure that they could be seen as mutually exclusive and dichotomous categories. And so this is the coding index that I used. And I, of course, explained and defined what all of these terms mean, but just for the sake of this presentation and to keep it as neat and simple as possible, basically, so any given article can either focus on discord and differences or agreement and commonalities. have a focus on a single party or portray the party as a two-party conflict or have a multi-party orientation. Non-solution or solution orientation, be focused on the here and now or provide a bigger picture, focus on elite or focus on people, show visible signs and effects or invisible signs and effects, be partisan or non-partisan, use victimizing language or not, use demonizing language or not, and use emotive words or not. And so just this slide is just to demonstrate sort of the appropriateness of using this particular index in this particular instance. So these are phrases that were taken from the IWPR training manual, and it just shows that they closely line up with the peace journalism indicators. So for example, identifies areas of agreement rather than discord compared to agreement and commonalities orientation. The goal of sensitive reporting is not to adopt one side over the other, which is a nonpartisan orientation. So other than the few changes that I made to Lee and Maslog's index, I mostly followed their research design. So basically each article was coded for the presence of these war journalism indicators and peace journalism indicators. So they would get a point if the war journalism, they would get a point for war journalism if for every one of the indicators that was present, and a point for peace journalism for any one of those indicators that were present. And then I added them up, and each article was assigned a war score and a peace score. So because they were dichotomous categories, the two scores would always add up to 10, and that limited the number of possible score combinations. So an article could have a score of 10 and a war score of 10 and a peace score of 0, a war score of 9 and a peace score of 1, and on and on and on. And then I used that, those combined scores to classify the conflict frame as either war journalism or peace journalism. So if the war score was greater than the peace score, then it was considered to be war journalism. If the war score equaled the peace score, it was considered to be neutral. The only score that's neutral is 5 and 5. And if the peace score was greater than the war score, then it was considered to have a journalism frame. So the answer to my first research questions are war frames or peace frames more prevalent in Pajwak's coverage. There are a couple ways you could think about that. I calculated the means of the average of the stories, and so the average war score was 5.44 and the average peace score was 4.56. So by that measure, their coverage is more oriented towards war than peace. And then also, if you just look at the prevalence of the conflict frames, you can see that 66% of the articles exhibited a war journalism frame, 18% exhibited a peace journalism frame, and 15% were neutral. And this is just sort of another way of thinking about it. I also looked at the frequency that individual score combinations showed up. So in this graph, the x-axis is the peace journalism score, and the y-axis is the war journalism score. So, and then the bubbles are the percentage of stories that fall into each of those scores. So you can see that 53% of the time, the articles had a war score of 6 and a peace score of 4. And then my second research question, which war journalism indicators and peace journalism indicators are most prevalent and least prevalent in Pajwak's coverage? And they, you probably can't see this very well, but these are the war and peace journalism indicators. And you can see over 80% of the time, 4 particular peace journalism indicators are present. And so that's non-partisanship, non-demonizing language, non-emotive language, and non-victimizing language. And then conversely, the other 6 peace indicators are hardly ever present. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, so I'll just gloss over it now. My third question about whether the conflict frames vary depending on these other features of the story, I'm still working on that. I've run the data several times, but I keep having to collapse my variables so that I have data that's significant and meaningful and everything. So what I'm finding so far and what I think I'm going to find in the end is that the author and the editor don't make much difference in the conflict frames, but that the sources and the conflict that's discussed in the theater of the conflict do. So for my qualitative methods, as I said, I did participant observation at the agency, and the participant part of that was that I was an intern. So I spent some time in the English service, copy editing stories, and I also spent time in the photo department, just helping them figure out how to streamline their work process and how to figure out how to train their photographers to write captions correctly and things like that. I also reviewed some of the internal documents at Pajwak, like their editorial guidelines, and I did semi-structured and unstructured interviews with the owner and founder of Pajwak, 3 of the original consultants who helped to found the agency, 4 of the editors, and 4 of the reporters. So my 4th research question, what influences Pajwak's conflict framing practices at the individual level, routines level, organizational level, and extra-media level? Essentially, this question is asking why did we get the answers that we did to the first 3 research questions in the quantitative portion. So just to remind you what we found, there's a dominant war frame. The score of the war score of 6 and the peace score of 4 showed up over 50% of the time, and the same 4 peace journalism indicators were consistently present, and the same 6 peace journalism indicators were consistently not present. So in order to figure out why that is, I adopted this hierarchy of influences model that was adopted from Shoemaker and Rees, and it's specific to media influences. So it looks at what's influencing content at an individual level, at a routines level, at an organizational level, extra media, and ideological level. So some of the questions I used to get at those influences, these are just samples. So when I asked people, why did you become a journalist, that would give me insight into the sort of the individual level of influences. What's the most important role of journalism? That would give me insight into the routines level, because journalistic norms are considered to exist at the routines level. What policies and procedures exist to make sure Pajwak is meeting its own standards has to do with the organizational level. What conditions in Afghanistan make it difficult for you to do your job? That would be extra media. And so then I also found when I was trying to analyze my qualitative data that it was useful to sort of regroup the peace journalism indicators into different clusters. So what I decided was that 4 of the peace journalism indicators are really all associated with neutrality. So nonpartisanship, the language indicators, not using victimizing language or demonizing language or emotive language. Then 4 of those indicators are really about providing context and explaining the conflict, showing the invisible signs and effects of war, the bigger picture, how the conflict is affecting people, and what parties are involved in participating and influencing the conflict. And then 2 of the indicators are actually focused on discussing topics of peace. So a focus on agreement and a focus on solutions. And I'm going to talk about this more in my thesis, but it's really these 2 topics that sort of distinguish peace journalism from what otherwise would just be, thorough journalism, providing context and being neutral, and all these other norms are pretty well established. And based on the results of our content analysis, it's the 4 neutrality indicators that are always pretty much consistently present in Pajwak's coverage, and it's the context and the specific peace topic indicators that are not present in Pajwak's coverage. So I can kind of reconceptualize this question as, why is Pajwak's content consistently neutral but lacking in context and a focus on topics related to peace building? So that's the real question that I was trying to answer with my qualitative data. And so I went through and applied labels according to the influence level that was present, according to those 3 clusters of peace journalism indicators that we discussed, neutrality, context, and a topic of peace building, and then according to the unique topic of whatever was being discussed in that data. And so organizing it this way allowed a number of themes and relationships to emerge. And I obviously won't have time to talk about all of those things today, so I'm just going to touch on a couple of the more salient findings. And I think as good a place as any to start is at the beginning and look at the situation when PAJWAC was still forming. So when the IWPR director arrived, she was coming from the Balkans, and she talked a lot about how her experience in Afghanistan compared to that experience. And so this is kind of a long quote, but I think it really contains a lot of important information. So she said, "I don't mean to say that I was working with people who weren't literate. They weren't illiterate, but their education had been very scattered and sporadic. I mean, they were refugees. It's not like they got to sit in class. So even in the former Soviet republics, for example, the Balkans, people went to school and they had sort of normal-ish lives, whereas the Afghans I was working with didn't have any of that. And even if they had stayed in Afghanistan and weren't refugees, they were women. They hadn't gone to school because of the Taliban. So almost everyone that we were working with had limited or not very good or consistent education. And those are things that are prerequisites for even basic reporting, just talking about the who, what, where, when, why stuff, let alone something that's more advanced or enhanced as peace journalism." So here she's clearly talking about how the situation in the country, the instability affected the individual level. But then also we discussed how those same conditions prevented any kind of media sector from being established in Afghanistan. And so there was just this absence of information. And so a quote related to that, she said, "They just needed to know basic stuff like what's the price of bread this week, or what road has opened up, or is it safe to go to such and such province?" I mean, they needed very basic information. And so that was part of what we thought was needed if you wanted to build the whole sector. So we needed local trainers, infrastructure, and essentially a news agency. And so this is just an example of how those particular quotes can be used to do this analysis of the hierarchy of influences. So you have this sort of, pervasive presence of war and insecurity. And at the ideological level, that breeds authoritarianism and warlordism and a devaluation of civic life. And those conditions make it difficult for an individual to have educational opportunities. And because of those, as Beth said, because they were dealing with a situation where people didn't have strong educational backgrounds, they had to sort of scale back their trainings and provide much more basic training. And so they had to teach people what a quote was and how to distinguish fact from opinion, or just what is the difference between fact and opinion. And so that sort of scaling back and focusing on the very basics of journalism led to an internalization of the disseminator role among the staff that works for PAJWAC. And so the disseminator role, obviously journalism can perform many different functions in society, but at the sort of broadest level, you can think of journalism as performing three basic functions. One is the disseminator role, which is just transferring information to the public. The other two are an interpretive role and an adversarial role. And the interpretive and adversarial roles obviously require extra layers of processing and more sophisticated analysis than just the disseminator role does. And so one quote that kind of exemplifies this internalization of the disseminator role, when asked what the most important role of journalism was in society, one of the editors said, just like people need to eat food, they need information. Without journalism, people have no information. It's like not having food. And then going back up to, starting sort of over again at the ideological level and the power dynamics of authoritarianism and warlordism and the devaluation of civic life, that also affected the media sector, or the lack of media sector and the lack of basic information. And as Beth said in those quotes, those things led them to believe they needed to fill this need of providing basic information and caused them to adopt the model of a news agency. And this isn't to say that all news agencies can only perform the disseminator role. They can play the adversarial role and the interpretive role as well. But the point is that in this case, they felt that there was a need to have an organization that could get very basic information out to the people quickly and provide that basic information that they needed. And then that role gets institutionalized at the organizational level. And I think that's really eminently clear in Pajwak's motto, which is reflecting the truth. And so that motto, it sort of implies that the truth is something that is self-evident, that it doesn't require layers of interpretation. It's something that you can just hold a mirror up to and it will be reflected back in this sort of passive way. Those things play into the, that seeing their role as being disseminators of information, of sort of transferring basic information to the public, plays into their emphasis on neutrality and the lack of context in their stories. And then the only other thing point that I wanted to talk about a little bit is how in some cases their norm of neutrality can actually interfere with their ability to provide context in some cases. So here's another, that's just another way of looking at that information. So this is another rather long quote from the executive editor of Pajwak. He says, "It's Pajwak policy that if there is a problem between Hazara and Kuchi or Hazara and Tajik, we do not mention, for example, Panjshiri are creating problems for Hazara people. And just so you know, these are different ethnic and tribal groups within Afghanistan." So he says, because if somebody sees that, maybe it will cause a problem. Pajwak doesn't want to highlight that kind of problem and create even more problems for our society. That is our editorial policy. There was recently fighting between Kuchi and Hazara people in Maidan Wardak in Besud. We cover the story, explain what's going on, but not so that the Kuchi will become more against Hazara or Hazara will become against Kuchis. Pajwak so many times faces that kind of issue. In our news meetings, we decide if that story comes up, we will not focus on the tribal issue, but we can cover the story by a normal way. We should highlight what's happening, but not change the environment to create more conflict. And so this is a story that was written about this particular situation that he was telling me about. And the story is probably shorter than the quote, so I might as well just go ahead and read it. So it says, Kuchi tribesmen on Monday carried out a protest demonstration against what they said is illegal seizure of their pastures by powerful individuals in the Chahar Asyab district of central Kabul province. Nearly 1,500 Kuchis attended the demonstration that started from Sakha Desert and ended at the Zahirabad Bridge area in Muhammad Aghai district of neighboring Logar province. The protesters issued a resolution saying that some political and powerful individuals had grabbed and sealed their grazing lands. They demanded the government should forthwith retake the lands from their grabbers. Kuchi tribal elder Haji Awak Khan Kakuzai told Pajwak Afghan News lands belonging to Kuchi people had been grabbed in Besud district of central Maidan Wardak province and Bamiyan, Logar, and other provinces. He said they had ownership documents of the lands. The resolution said the government should allocate a specific land in Chahar Asyab district for Kuchi tribesmen to live on. So the interesting thing about this is that, okay, so I told you earlier that Pajwak also has a photo and video service. So they actually have video on their website from this protest, and their video services, they provide raw footage for other television channels. So they're not producing packages that you would see on the news. They film interviews, they film events, and they sell them to other news organizations that then incorporate that into their broadcast. So there's this raw footage of interviews with some of the people that are pictured in the photograph here, and they're talking about the ethnic and tribal dynamic of this issue. And I was thinking about playing it for you if I had time to translate it, but I didn't, and so it wouldn't really mean anything to you to just watch a bunch of people talking in Pashto. The point is that the story ended up being sanitized of all of those ethnic and ethnic references, which is part of their sort of mandate, as Yassine explained. They see their role as sort of maintaining harmonious relationships between communities. But the story is so sanitized that it's virtually meaningless. It doesn't really provide any information. All we know is that we don't know who it was responsible for seizing this land. It just says powerful individuals. We don't know how long this problem has been going on. We don't know what purpose the land was seized for or anything like that. While they're you know, they want to remain neutral, they want to remain nonpartisan, and they see themselves as having this important role of not inflaming communal tensions within their own country. And I think that they do this sort of in the spirit of peace journalism, but they're sort of missing that key component that peace journalism also calls for providing context, for making conflict transparent, not opaque, not pretending that certain issues don't exist in the hopes that they'll go away, but dealing with them in a way that is respectful of all the parties involved and can help to lead to a solution in the conflict. So it's sort of, you know, I think that their heart is in the right place, but it's sort of a little bit of a misappropriation of the concept of peace journalism that they started with. And so I've talked for almost an hour, and I was like, wow, I have a whole hour to talk. You never get more than 15 minutes. And somehow I filled it all up. So anyway, well, I'll just save a couple minutes for questions.